Residents of Chicago's North Lawndale neighborhood had spent the better part of 6 years fighting John Christopher's pair of illegal dumps. In talking with some of these residents, it was clear to them that this happened in their neighborhood because it was a Black neighborhood. It was not a coincidence. It was by design.
So that just goes to show me what you think of Black people and poor Black communities. We can put this here.
This ward, they didn't care. This 24th ward was like a dumping ground to them.
It just wouldn't have happened in any other neighborhood, I don't think.
Anything can be done to Black people. Anything.
When a similar dump cropped up in a mostly white Chicago neighborhood, the one next to Lane Tech High School, city officials shut it down fast. And Operation Silver Shovel, the FBI's carefully orchestrated investigation into public corruption, sprung from the North Lawndale dumps without factoring in a plan for a cleanup. That's our ongoing story in Chicago, a city notorious for public corruption and racial divisions. But what we saw unfolding in North Lawndale is just a symptom of a much bigger problem, one that is not confined to Chicago. Black and brown communities all over the country are disproportionately impacted by environmental hazards. We know this in part because of a man named Robert Bullard.
My grandmother lived on a road where the landfill was located. I remember this, vividly. We would go there on Sunday. We would go up there, and the landfill was a burning landfill. And we would go up there and play. We thought nothing about it.
Bullard and his family are Black. And even as a child growing up in Alabama in the 1950s and 60s, he noticed that the dumps like the one near his grandmother's house seemed to be located mostly in Black neighborhoods.
I only later discovered that was more than just a hunch.
Bullard grew up to be a sociologist, and when he was teaching in Houston in the late 1970s, he got involved with a group of Black homeowners fighting a landfill proposed for their neighborhood. And these Houston residents started saying the same kinds of things you heard people in North Lawndale say in previous episodes. This is happening to us because we are Black. Only they were saying it roughly 20 years before the dumps sprang up in North Lawndale. Bullard wondered, could he find a way to prove this? And prove it beyond dispute.
It was very clear. And it didn't take a rocket scientist or a PhD to put the pieces together. But it did take a PhD and a lawsuit to connect the dots, unfortunately.
Robert Bullard's efforts to tie dumping to racial discrimination, first in Black neighborhoods in Houston and later in Black and brown neighborhoods all across the country, started with magic markers, push pins, and paper maps. From those humble beginnings, his work would help spark a movement. It gave this type of discrimination a name, and it would ultimately force officials at the highest levels of government to confront the kind of injustice that we've been telling you about in North Lawndale.
I never knew that we would, stumble on something that nobody else had done.
I'm Robin Amer, and from USA Today, this is The City. In our last episode, Operation Silver Shovel became front-page news. Aldermen and other city officials went to prison, and the feds gave John Christopher a new life. But the 6-story mountain of rubble in Chicago's North Lawndale neighborhood was still there, and there was no plan to get rid of it. In this episode, we're going to hit pause on the Chicago story, because we want to zoom out and look at the big picture. Whether the dumping in North Lawndale is indicative of a larger national problem. So we're going to take a side trip 1,000 miles south of Chicago to Houston. And we're going to go back to the 1970s, roughly 20 years before the first trucks dumped their first loads of debris in North Lawndale. Earlier this year, I went to Houston with our reporter, Wilson Sayer. She's going to pick up the story from here.
In 1971, Margaret and Charles Bean were representative of an emerging black middle class in America. Charles worked at the Goodyear tire plant, making artificial rubber, and was active in the union, making sure black workers had the same opportunities as their white colleagues. Margaret worked at a factory where they made little fruit pies. She had grown up most of her life in Houston, and he had grown up in the country, but had always wanted more of a social life than the country had to offer. And now they had kids and had outgrown the apartment they got together after getting married. The couple wanted to buy a home, the type of place they could grow their family and raise children, a place to have barbecues in the backyard and chat with their neighbors on walks. Charles Bean heard about a neighborhood, Northwood Manor, that was being marketed to young black families like theirs.
My brother was living out there, so we moved out there for that reason, along with the advertisement on the radio stations. They were, advertising that area.
Houston is a huge, sprawling metropolis, and Northwood Manor is out on the city's northeastern edge, where the suburbs give way to more rural surroundings. The pine forest there had been cleared to build neat one-story brick ranch homes with carports and perfectly manicured lawns.
And I was very impressed with the one that the model home that I saw. And my daughter Tangela was with me at that time, and I asked her, what did she think? And of course, she liked it. And so we went and looked at it, and we said, yes, we're going to take this one right here.
The house the Beans bought had pomegranate, peach, and plum trees in the front yard. It was their dream home. Here's Margaret.
Well, I was able to start my family there, raise my family. I was able to meet my neighbors, and we often would go outside and talk. And so that's what made me love my neighborhood.
Then, in 1978, 7 years after making Northwood Manor their home, one of Margaret's neighbors mentioned to her that a company was clearing trees just down the street right next to their neighborhood in order to make room for a new landfill.
I was very, very surprised. I didn't think they would put that type of landfill next to our high school. Our high school, Smiley High School, was on the side of the landfill.
The fruit trees, the manicured lawns, everything that residents loved about living in Northwood Manor would now be next to dirty diapers, rotten food, and all of the garbage that other Houston residents wanted out of their homes. It would be hauled away and left next to Charles and Margaret Bean's home. A disturbing thought nagged at Charles Bean and his neighbors, the same thought that would be shared 20 years later by North Lawndale residents. This is happening because this is a black neighborhood.
I felt insulted. Yeah, it's like you get the idea that all the undesirable things is geared toward us. The railroad tracks, the waste treatment plants, and everything that's undesirable. You get the idea that that's what's concentrated in your neighborhood.
Adding to the insult was that the company behind the landfill was marketing it to Northwood Manor residents as a sanitary landfill called Whispering Pines, a term and a name that evoke something lovely, sweet-smelling, and hushed. The residents knew it would be anything but.
If you think about the name Whispering Pine, see, that sounds pretty good. And if you're not mindful of what's actually going on there, then you probably would think that it was clean, like sanitary. There was everything but sanitary.
Just like the families in North Lawndale, who saw a dump rise in their neighborhood across from Sumner Elementary School, the residents in Houston's Northwood Manor worried about the smell and the trucks and the negative impact the dump would have on their property values. That wasn't what the Beans wanted for their neighborhood, so they started to rally their neighbors to fight the dump.
We went from door to door, knocking to give out leaflets to let our neighbors know what they're proposing to do.
They organized meetings at the True Light Missionary Baptist Church and the Barbara Jordan Community Center.
Margaret was going around and they had a bullhorn and they was telling residents and passing out flyers.
This is Pat Rowe, one of Margaret and Charles Bean's neighbors. They're best friends now, and they met during this fight.
They said, do you know that we're having a meeting tonight and they're putting a landfill next door? And we're talking about next door where? Well, that was unheard of because all you had then was a wooded area. You could throw a rock and land it in the landfill from where we were. So that really got a lot of people riled up because they were just buying homes and all this good stuff.
The news that a landfill was coming to her neighborhood was incredibly distressing for Ms. Rowe. She knew exactly how awful living next to a landfill could be. When she was a kid, she grew up on a street that dead-ended by another dump. This was in another predominantly black neighborhood in Houston.
And we used to have so much trash and stuff and see these big mounds. But the worst thing was the rodents and the stray animals that it brought. The stench was unbearable.
The dump attracted so many animals that would run through their yard, her dad had to set out raccoon traps. She said neighbors would sometimes come by and watch cats battle the dump's rats.
I mean, some of our neighbors would actually sit there and bet if the cat or the rat was going to win the fight. And in some cases, baby, those rats were bigger than the cats. Bigger. And that was a horrible life for a teenager. But, you know, we lived it until he said no more.
Her family just walked away from that house, abandoned it. That was her childhood. And here she was, a new mother herself in a new house, confronting the idea that her own children would also grow up next to a dump. She was not going to let that happen.
Yeah, we took over. We didn't get involved. We took over.
Pat Rowe joined the Beans and several other neighbors to form a neighborhood alliance. The plan: to file a lawsuit against the private company building the landfill and convince a judge to issue an injunction. That would stop the dump before it could ever get started, before that first pile of rotting garbage could be trucked into their neighborhood.
We wanted to stop it in its tracks, and they were trying to build it as fast as they could.
So the group hired an attorney named Linda Bullard, and she filed a lawsuit in county court in October of 1979. The crux of their legal argument was that putting the dump in a predominantly black community amounted to racial discrimination. But how do you prove this kind of discrimination in a court of law? Where's the concrete evidence that one dump in one black neighborhood is the sort of racial injustice that requires a judge to make things right? Linda Bullard declined our invitation to talk about this case. But we spoke to her ex-husband, Dr. Robert Bullard. And Dr. Bullard was the one who wound up wrestling with these questions about proof. The way Dr. Bullard tells it, his wife walked in one day with an unexpected piece of news.
She came home and said, "Bob, I filed a lawsuit against the state of Texas." And I said, "You did what? You sued Texas?" I said, "You sued my employer."
Technically, that was true. Dr. Bullard was a professor and researcher at Houston's Texas Southern University, a public college. Linda Bullard had also filed the lawsuit against the city of Houston, Harris County, Southwestern Waste Management, the company trying to build the landfill, and Browning Ferris Industries, or BFI, the company that was supposed to operate the landfill. BFI was headquartered in Houston, and for a time, it was the second largest waste management company in the world. Northwood Manor residents were up against an assembly of deep-pocketed defendants. Meanwhile, they collected change door to door to help pay for legal fees. Linda Bullard told her husband they were going to need some help.
She said, I sued them, and I need someone to assist and support and gather data for this lawsuit.
Ms. Bullard thought the residents of Northwood Manor were onto something bigger. She thought they had a chance to prove that this dump in this Black neighborhood was not an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern. But she needed help proving that.
I said, you need a sociologist. She said, that's what you are, right?
Right. Dr. Bullard would take on the challenge and try to figure out if there was a pattern.
That's after the break.
There's nobody on the planet like you. So why would you buy a generic mattress built for everyone else? Helix Sleep built a quiz that takes just 2 minutes to complete. I took it, and they used the answers to match my body type and sleep preferences to the perfect mattress for me. I was matched to the Helix Dusk, and this last month has truly been the best sleep I have ever gotten. I also tacked on a cooling cover to my order, and that last-minute decision turned out to be a great one. I used to be such a sweater at night, but not anymore. Do what I did and go to helixsleep.com/thecity. Take their 2-minute sleep quiz, and they'll match you to a mattress that will give you the best sleep of your life. Right now, Helix is offering up to $125 off all mattress orders. And all you have to do to get up to $125 off your mattress is go to helixsleep.com/thecity. That's helixsleep.com/thecity for $125 off your mattress order. helixsleep.com/thecity.
In 1979, the same year Northwood Manor residents filed a lawsuit to fight the dump proposed for their neighborhood, Dr. Robert Bullard was still a relatively new sociology professor at Houston's historically Black Texas Southern University. Let's go back to Wilson.
Robert Bullard split his time between research and teaching. One of his idols was W.E.B. Du Bois, who, like Dr. Bullard, was a Black sociologist. Du Bois was the first Black person to earn a doctorate from Harvard and one of the founders of the NAACP. Dr. Bullard admired what he called Du Bois's brand of kick-ass sociology, combining hard research with social activism. And now, Dr. Bullard suddenly found himself confronted with the same kind of issue that Du Bois himself might have tackled. Was racial discrimination to blame for Northwood Manor's landfill problem? Getting testimony from Black residents who believed this was true wasn't going to sway a judge. He needed to come up with solid evidence, and he needed to produce it fast enough to help stop the landfill before it could open. The clock was ticking.
When I think about that period of time, it was frantic. It was emotionally draining because you're embarking on something in terms of trying to collect data. You're trying to put together a puzzle that you don't have a lot of time to think about. It's full steam ahead.
Dr. Bullard wanted to know whether there was a link between the locations of waste facilities and the demographics of the surrounding neighborhoods. He enlisted the students from his research methods class to gather data. Their first step was to find all of the garbage facilities that had been built in Houston dating back to the 1930s. Keep in mind, this is happening in the late 1970s. You couldn't just Google a list of all of the dumps and incinerators. Even a phone book was of little use, because going back to the 1930s meant that some of the waste facilities had been closed for years. So Dr. Bullard and his students started digging into dusty old filing cabinets in City Hall, pulling up newspaper clippings on microfiche, and interviewing old-timers in the community to ask if they remembered where various dumps had been located.
And I started giving my students the list. This student might have 5 on a list, and they'd go out and verify, and then we'd come back and put it on a map.
And when the other methods failed, Dr. Bullard told them to trust their eyes.
And I would tell my students, I say, if you see a mountain in Houston is flat, parts of it below sea level, If you see a mountain in Houston, be suspicious. Landfill.
Once his students had cobbled together the list of dumps, they looked at the demographics of the surrounding neighborhoods. Again, this is the 1970s. Today, a sociologist would tackle this problem with all sorts of modern tools, GPS, digital maps, and powerful computer programs. Dr. Bullard had none of those tools. They weren't widely available at the time. When he needed to run a computer analysis, he did it using one of those massive computers you might see in a movie. It took up more space than a row of refrigerators and had significantly less computing power than an iPhone.
And I reran the data on mainframe computer on punch cards. So this is how ancient it is. It's like having a chisel and a hammer and a rock.
He laid out big paper maps of Houston on the floor and used magic markers to color in the neighborhoods to reflect the demographics of the people who lived there.
Yellow is less than 10% minority. Orange was 10 to 39, and the other one's like 40 to 49. Red was 50% above minority.
Dr. Bullard used push pins to mark locations of the dumps and incinerators.
And as those pins would come in, we started to see a pattern. Most of the pins would come in red.
Pin after pin went into sections of the map colored red, the majority black neighborhoods. It wasn't just the proposed Whispering Pines landfill.
When the pins started to come into the red is when I knew that this was not something that was a fluke or was by accident. This was willful, it was on purpose, systematic, that city council members over that period of time had decided that the pins were going in the red.
Even though he had a hunch about what they might find, Dr. Bullard was astonished at how stark the discrepancies actually were, as illustrated by this map. From the 1930s through 1978, 5 out of 5 city-owned landfills were in predominantly black neighborhoods. 6 out of the 8 city-owned incinerators were in predominantly black neighborhoods. And 4 of the 4 privately owned landfills were in predominantly black neighborhoods.
For me, that was an aha moment. Aha! Oh, light bulb moment. Oh, this is an issue of discrimination. 82% of all the garbage, the waste, solid waste dumped in Houston over that period of time was dumped in predominantly black neighborhoods, even though blacks only made up 25% of the population.
Remember, we heard the allegation from the residents in North Lawndale and Northwood Manor that they were the ones most often stuck dealing with their city's waste. But it wasn't until Dr. Bullard finished this map that there was, for the first time ever, actual empirical evidence.
And so these were decisions, intentional decisions made by white men. Put the garbage over there, put it over there, put it over there, and there invariably was in black communities, black neighborhoods in Houston.
This is what Bullard and others would ultimately call environmental discrimination, or environmental racism, a practice of disproportionately burdening black and brown communities with environmental hazards that wouldn't be allowed in white communities. Armed with this evidence, attorney Linda Bullard felt like she had what she needed. She could argue that this type of environmental discrimination was no different than housing discrimination, or employment discrimination, or voting discrimination. It violated the Civil Rights Act.
This was the first environmental racism lawsuit to use civil rights law. We didn't know what we were setting out to do, other than this was a form of discrimination. It was a form of racism in the way that environmental policies are being implemented.
This map seemed to be the smoking gun, the type of thing that anybody with a pair of eyes could look at and realize, hey, there's a clear connection here. But the two judges in the case disagreed. The judge presiding over the initial hearings was swayed by a different set of maps provided by the waste companies. Their maps purported to show that there was not a connection between landfills and black communities in Houston. The judge found these maps more credible and sided with the landfill companies. So how could the judge have rejected Dr. Bullard's work? I'm going to get a bit in the weeds about how a data analysis like this is done, but bear with me. When Dr. Bullard did his analysis, he was looking at the demographics of the neighborhood immediately surrounding the landfill, the communities most impacted by the sight, smell, noise, and vermin of a dump. The companies, however, used the entire census tract where the landfill was located. That's a much bigger area, potentially involving thousands of residents instead of just a few hundred that make up a neighborhood. Both methods are valid, but at the time, using census tracts, what the companies used, was the more common and established method. There wasn't a single agreed-upon way to define or measure a neighborhood. That said, it's hard to argue that Dr. Bullard's method was not, at least, more relevant. Think about your own home. You're probably more likely to get upset about a dump opening at the edge of your neighborhood than one opening up at the edge of your census tract, which could be several miles away. So we asked Mark Nichols, one of our data journalists here at USA Today, to use 2018 technology to tackle the same question Dr. Bullard faced. Here's Mark.
Well, what we were really trying to figure out, I think, was whether the neighborhoods in which these waste sites were contained basically had a greater proportion of non-white residents.
I'm not going to bore you with all the details behind this analysis, but essentially we pulled a list of all of the landfills operating in Houston from the state of Texas's website. Then, using a computer program called ArcGIS, Mark drew circles around the dump sites. One circle had a 1-mile radius, another had a 3-mile radius. Then the program pulled in all of the demographic data about the people living within those circles, and we could see who was living close to these landfills. Bottom line, Mark's analysis squared with Dr. Bullard's. In Houston, garbage is far more likely to wind up in the city's black and brown neighborhoods. But because Dr. Bullard was not able to convince the judges that his methods were sound, the residents of Northwood Manor did not get an injunction to stop the dump. The Whispering Pines landfill opened in 1980. A few years later, they lost the whole legal battle to shut down the dump. In a pretty scathing opinion, the second judge rejected Dr. Bullard's map and analysis, calling it inaccurate and subjective. By then, the landfill was estimated to be taking in between 1,500 and 2,000 tons of garbage per day. And according to Margaret Bean, who later remarried and now goes by Margaret Lair, the landfill was as bad as the residents feared it would be.
That is when we started to see the heavy trucks speeding up and down Little York Road. At nighttime, we would smell this horrible odor.
If you've ever been to Texas in the summertime, you know that the heat can be intense. Temperatures in the 90s baked the mounds of garbage piling up at Whispering Pines. Garbage would fly off the trucks and collect along the sides of the roads. Margaret Lair said that you could smell the dump's overpowering odor throughout the neighborhood, which may be why the developer stopped building new homes there. She told us about the small white birds, what she called dump birds, that would land on the garbage at Whispering Pines, then fly over to the high school. She worried about what germs they might be spreading to her daughter and the other kids at the school. Last year, after living in Northwood Manor for more than 45 years, Margaret Lair moved away.
I'm happy I don't live over here anymore, but I feel sorry for the people that still have to stay and cannot move. I was able to afford to move. You got a lot of people out here can't afford to move.
She feels the neighborhood started to go downhill when the landfill arrived. She showed me and Robin around during our visit. She brought us to what used to be Smiley High School, where you could see the landfill from the bleachers at the school's stadium.
You could actually see the dump from here. You could see it was so close. The landfill was so close, you can actually sit in the bleachers and see the dump. The trees wasn't here.
Oh, so really close.
Very close, very close. In fact, you could just even walk to it. It's so close.
Would you come to football games here?
Yes.
And would you be able to see and smell the dump while you were sitting in the stadium?
Yes. Yes. It smelled like a rotten odor.
Later, Ms. Lair drove us across the street, right up to the landfill. And it's massive. At 180 acres, it's nearly a quarter the size of Central Park and 10 times the size of the bigger dump in North Lawndale. At the entrance of the facility, Robin spotted some old signs. They looked like they'd been there since the dump opened in the 80s.
One of them says, no dead animals, please. And one of them says, all tires must be split, quartered, or shredded prior to disposal. Absolutely no whole tires can be accepted. And then there's another sign that says, no appliances, small appliances. So, I mean, this to me is just an indication of like all of the different kinds of things that people would try to dump there, including dead animals.
Quite sure they did dump there. Dead animals or tires or refrigerators.
According to state records, the dump is still taking garbage 40 years after it first opened. Although Northwood Manor residents would ultimately lose their court battle, they didn't go down quietly. They protested at the dumps and at City Hall. Houston didn't and still doesn't have zoning laws, the kind of rules that prohibit industrial facilities from being built in a residential neighborhood. But the lawsuit and the publicity from the protests resulted in new laws that restricted where future dumps could go. Houston officials also decided that they would not allow any city trucks to dump at Whispering Pines. And in what could be viewed as an acknowledgement that Dr. Bullard's research touched on a very real problem, the state of Texas changed its criteria for deciding where to place landfills. For the first time, officials had to take demographics into account before approving a new dump site. This did not help neighborhoods with existing dumps like Northwood Manor, but these changes energized Dr. Bullard. Now, he wanted to use the same methodology he'd used in the Whispering Pines case to see if placing waste in Black and brown neighborhoods wasn't just a Northwood Manor problem, or a Houston problem, or even a Texas problem. He thought it could be something even bigger. And he was right.
We lost the case, but we won a whole movement.
That's after the break. Let's go back to Wilson.
Robert Bullard knew that it wasn't just piles of construction debris or landfills teeming with garbage that people didn't want in their residential neighborhoods. Factories, chemical plants, contaminated land, they were all potentially harmful to people living nearby. He wanted to understand the full extent of this problem.
I decided to go on a tear, and that was the boys in me, is to start writing, start documenting.
He started to look outside of Houston.
I want to know, is this happening in other places? So I wrote the grant, got it funded, and I said, I want to look at the South, see this Southern thing.
And when he looked, he found examples of other communities that had been subject to terrible pollution. Neighborhoods near lead smelting facilities in Dallas, hazardous waste dumps in Sumter County, Alabama, a stretch of chemical plants and refineries between New Orleans and Baton Rouge so notorious for making people sick it was known as Cancer Alley. In each case, Dr. Bullard noted it was the Black and brown communities most impacted.
The pattern in Houston basically was replicated across the South, and that African American communities were being singled out for locally unwanted land uses, with landfills, incinerators, garbage dumps, chemical plants, those dangerous facilities. Houston was no fluke.
Houston was not alone. Environmental hazards were disproportionately in Black and brown communities all over the country. These were the things that no one would want to live near.
Well, you know, the idea that NIMBY, not in my backyard, had really taken hold. Instead of NIMBY, what we found was PIBBY, place in Black's backyard, PIBBY.
Dr. Bullard wrote up his findings, first in academic journals, then in a book he titled Dumping in Dixie. But he had trouble finding a receptive audience. He was pitching ideas that no one had previously defined or recognized.
And I got nasty notes back saying, well, you can't use race and environment in the same sentence. There's no such thing as environmental justice. You know, the environment is neutral. There's no disparity in terms of environment.
He even had trouble convincing mainstream environmental groups and civil rights groups that racial injustice and the environment were topics they needed to rally around together.
And it took almost 2 decades before our civil rights organizations and our green groups understood how these two things connected.
But through his research, Dr. Bullard started to hear about other Black and brown communities all over the country that were also banding together to fight toxic dumps, landfills, and other industrial facilities in their neighborhoods. A group in rural North Carolina had fought the dumping of toxic oil along the roads in their community. A group in Dickson County, Tennessee, was trying to fight a landfill. Researchers were looking at the locations of hazardous waste facilities in Los Angeles, and there were more. These were relatively small grassroots groups, but a name for what they were seeing started to take hold. It pointed to a broader understanding that this growing national movement was about more than just stopping individual landfills from popping up in certain areas. This was environmental racism, and the people involved in the movement against it were fighting for environmental justice. This group started to meet and hold conferences throughout the early 1990s. They were trying to change the system that had allowed a mountain of construction debris to pile up in Chicago's North Lawndale neighborhood with no repercussions, a situation that was unfolding at this very same time. It had taken the Voting Rights Act to address voting discrimination and Title VII of the Civil Rights Act to address workplace discrimination. So this group of environmental justice advocates began to push for the same kind of landmark legal protections to reckon with environmental discrimination. They started to write letters to government officials.
We wrote letters to the EPA. We wrote letters to the President's Council on Environmental Quality. We wrote letters to Health and Human Services, and we were requesting a meeting, a sit-down meeting.
And they got one. In 1991, they met with the head of President George H.W. Bush's EPA. Out of that meeting, the EPA created the Office of Environmental Equity, a division of the federal government tasked with studying the problem of environmental discrimination. A year later, the EPA released a report called Environmental Equity: Reducing Risk for All Communities. It echoed what Bullard and his colleagues in the movement and certain communities had been saying all along. Black and brown neighborhoods were disproportionately burdened with environmental hazards. But the big moment for this movement came in February 1994. Dr. Bullard and his colleagues were at a conference just outside of Washington, D.C.
A few of us got a call from the White House to come over to witness something.
They've been invited into the Oval Office to witness President Bill Clinton sign a new executive order.
And we went in, and Vice President Al Gore was the first to greet us when we came through the door. And then President Clinton was in the background, standing just in front of his desk.
The Environmental Justice Executive Order of 1994 instructed every federal agency to ensure that no one group of people was unfairly burdened with the country's waste. While the president signed the executive order, Dr. Bullard and the other activists gathered behind the president's desk for a commemorative photo. We showed the photo to Dr. Bullard.
Yeah, that's Dr. Wright, Beverly Wright there, and that's Senator Wellstone. And I was standing next to EPA Administrator Carol Browner. And John Lewis was there, and Senator Carol Mosley Braun, a senator from Illinois, and the Attorney General Janet Reno was there, and John Lewis, and we were all smiling.
These activists, the parents of the environmental justice movement, were here to watch their movement legitimized by the highest official in the country. The measure acknowledged that environmental racism was real. It was also a pledge that the federal government would do something about it.
We were all, just really, we never, thought that this is something that would happen. So environmental justice had reached the White House.
Later the same day, Carol Browner, then head of the EPA, walked into the White House press room and declared that it was time for the federal government to ensure environmental justice for every community in America.
The president, joined by representatives from community groups across this country, just signed an executive order. Nobody can question that for far too long, communities across this country, low-income, minority communities, have been asked to bear a disproportionate share of our modern industrial life. Today's executive order is designed and will seek to bring justice to these communities.
Standing next to Browner during this speech was U.S. Attorney General Janet Reno. She committed her agency's prosecutors to holding people and companies accountable for environmental discrimination. But at the very moment that President Clinton was signing the Environmental Justice Executive Order at the White House, in Chicago, Operation Silver Shovel was underway. A mob associate turned undercover informant by the name of John Christopher was illegally dumping debris in Chicago's black neighborhoods. And he was doing it while working for the FBI. If you drew a big enough org chart of the Justice Department at the time, John Christopher's boss's 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 boss, or whatever, was Attorney General Janet Reno. Recognizing a problem and doing something about it are two very different things. After the signing ceremony in Washington, it would still be another 2 years before Operation Silver Shovel thrust John Christopher's illegal dumps into the limelight. And even then, it wasn't angry residents writing letters or kids getting sick or injured that shamed government officials into fixing the problem. It wasn't even a newfound commitment to environmental justice. What ultimately got the debris out of North Lawndale was the publicity that followed a major public corruption scandal featuring a mob-connected mole. The kind of publicity that other communities across the United States will never get.
The outrage and embarrassment that followed in Silver Shovel's wake sparked a glimmer of hope as political leaders rushed in to try to fix the problem in North Lawndale.
The Silver Shovel story broke, and then the next thing I saw was Jesse Jackson standing on top of the pile saying, yeah, we did this. And we were saying, no, you didn't.
That's next time on The City. The City is a production of USA Today and is distributed in partnership with Wondery. You can subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or wherever you're listening right now. If you like the show, please rate and review us and be sure to tell your friends about us. Our show this week was reported and produced by Wilson Sayer, Jenny Casas, Sam Greenspan, and me, Robin Amer. Additional reporting for this episode by Mark Nichols. This episode was edited by Matt Doig, with additional editing from John Kelly and Amy Pyle. Ben Austin is our story consultant. Original music and mixing is by Hannes Brown. Legal review by Tom Curley. Additional production by Taylor Macon, Phil Corbett, Isabel Cockrell, and Bianca Medius. Our executive producer is Liz Nelson. Chris Davis is our VP for investigations. Scott Stein is our VP of product. The USA Today Network's president and publisher is Maribel Wadsworth. Thank you to our sponsors for supporting the show, and special thanks to Scout Bloom, Misha Youssef, and Danielle Svetkov. Additional support comes from the Fund for Investigative Journalism and the Social Justice News Nexus at Northwestern University. You can find us on Facebook and Twitter at The City Pod, or visit our website where you can see the Oval Office photo of Bill Clinton and Robert Bullard and the other environmental justice activists. Then, if you're in Chicago, please join me and the rest of the City team on Wednesday, December 5th for a live community conversation co-sponsored by WBEZ. We'll be at the Skyline Conference Center in North Lawndale. We'll take you behind the scenes of the podcast and introduce you to some of the North Lawndale residents who fought to get rid of the mountain. To reserve tickets, go to our website. That's thecitypodcast.com.